June 28, 1844. Carthage, Illinois. The body of Joseph Smith lies on a wooden table, still warm, 3 bullet wounds in his torso and 1 in his face. 40 miles away in Nauvoo, his wife Emma is waiting. She is 39 years old. She is pregnant with their last child. And she is the only person alive who can prevent the empire Brigham Young is about to build from being whole. Within 24 hours, she will make a decision that no official history of the Mormon movement has ever fully explained. She will refuse to go west. She will choose instead to become a ghost in the city her husband built, and she will haunt it for the next 35 years. When Brigham Young and the 12 apostles begin packing wagons for Utah, Emma stays. When they ask for the manuscripts of Joseph's unfinished translation of the Bible, she locks them away. When they ask for the deeds to the properties, she refuses to sign. When they ask her to stand publicly behind the 12, she answers with silence. What followed was a silent war that lasted 35 years. A war over land, over paper, over a name, over a bloodline. A war that ended with a second Mormon church rising in the Midwest under the leadership of Emma's own son, openly rejecting Brigham Young's authority. Before the end of this video, you will understand why Brigham Young, a man who would govern an empire of 70,000 people across the western frontier, could not move a single widow out of a single house in Illinois. And you will understand why, even today, almost 200 years later, the church she stood against still does not know how to talk about her. Part 1. The Widow Who Said No. In the summer of 1844, Nauvoo, Illinois, was one of the largest cities in the state. 12,000 people lived there. It had its own militia, its own newspaper, its own university charter, and almost every brick of it sat on land tied in some way to one name: Joseph Smith. Joseph had died with the city in his head and nothing of it written down clearly. Some properties were deeded personally to him. Some were held in trust for the church. Some were in Emma's name. The lines were a tangle, and the man who knew where every line was drawn was now lying in a casket. Within days, 2 power centers emerged. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles, led by a 43-year-old former carpenter named Brigham Young, claimed authority over the church. They had the keys, they argued. They had the priesthood. And in the largest house in the city stood Emma. She had the house. She had the papers. She had the children. She had her name on the deeds. The first confrontation came over the Nauvoo mansion. 22 rooms, the largest house in Nauvoo, used as both family home and hotel. Brigham Young wanted it turned over to the church. Emma refused. She did not give a sermon. She did not write a public letter. She did not raise her voice. She simply did not sign. This is where the legend of Emma Smith begins to take its real shape. In the months that followed Joseph's death, the men who came to her door, apostles, lawyers, emissaries, family members carrying messages from the 12, all learned the same lesson. Emma Smith's silence was the loudest sound in Nauvoo. She would receive a delegation. She would listen. She would offer water, sometimes a meal. And when they had finished explaining what the church required of her, she would say almost nothing. No promises, no agreements, no public statements they could use against her later. And the deeds, the manuscripts, the assets they had come for, would stay exactly where they were. The pattern repeated itself in different rooms with different documents for the next 2 years. The answer was always the same silence, followed by the same refusal to sign. But the properties were only the surface of the conflict. Beneath them, locked in a wooden box that traveled with Emma from house to house, was something far more dangerous to the future of Mormonism. Something that, if released, would have given Brigham Young absolute textual authority over the religion. Something that, if withheld, would split it permanently. What Emma had in that box, and what she ultimately did with it, is the part of this story almost no one tells. Part 2. The War Over the Papers. In the last years of his life, Joseph Smith had been working obsessively on what historians now call the Joseph Smith translation. He believed he was restoring the Bible to its original form. Hundreds of pages of manuscript, his own handwriting in places, notes, corrections, doctrinal expansions that did not appear in any other version of Scripture in the world. When Joseph died, the work was unfinished, and it was in Emma's house. For Brigham Young, getting those papers was not a power grab. It was survival. This is the part of the story that gets lost in the retellings. Young was not a man trying to enrich himself. He was a man preparing to lead 12,000 people into a wilderness no American had crossed before. He needed every piece of authority he could carry across the plains. The manuscript was authority. The deeds were authority. Without them, the migration was a religious gamble. In his mind, Emma was not an enemy. She was an obstacle, the obstacle between his people and their survival. Members of the 12 sent letters. They sent intermediaries. They sent direct requests. Emma did not hand over the manuscript, not in 1844, not in 1845, not in 1846 when the wagons left. Not ever. She also did not destroy it. She did not sell it. She did not give it to a museum or a newspaper that would have paid handsomely for the curiosity. She kept it. For 16 years. She kept it through her remarriage, through the births of more children, through the gold rush, through the Civil War, through the long, quiet rebuilding of her life as a respected citizen of Hancock County, Illinois. The manuscript stayed in her house. The properties war ran on a parallel track. Lawyers traded letters over deeds, debts, and claims against the Joseph Smith estate. Joseph had died deeply in debt. The church wanted certain properties as compensation for what it had funded. Emma wanted the same properties as security for her children. The outcome is clear. Emma kept the mansion house. She kept the homestead. She kept enough land to feed her family. On the core assets, she did not lose. Brigham Young was not a weak negotiator. He would go on to govern a territory the size of Western Europe. He would direct the relocation of tens of thousands of people across 2,000 miles of plains. He would build a financial empire on the western frontier. This was not a man who lost arguments, and he could not move Emma Smith from her house in Nauvoo. Two unshakable convictions had collided. Young believed he was saving the church Joseph had founded. Emma believed that what Young was saving was not what Joseph had built. It was something else, wearing Joseph's name. Neither side ever blinked. The harder question is why Emma chose this fight. The answer comes back to something she had been fighting long before Joseph's death. Something the 12 apostles were preparing to carry into Utah and make the center of their movement. Plural marriage. Part 3. The Exodus. She refused. In February 1846, the first wagons crossed the Mississippi River, ice still cracking under the wheels. Within months, thousands more would follow. The Exodus had begun. Emma did not go. The official narrative, repeated in Utah for generations, was that Emma had lost her faith, that she was emotionally fragile, perhaps unstable, certainly not the strong woman Joseph had once described as the elect lady. The record suggests something else entirely. Emma had opposed plural marriage during Joseph's life. She had opposed it in writing, in private conversation, and in the deeply uncomfortable spaces of her own home. There are accounts of confrontations. There are accounts of her demanding the practice be stopped. There are accounts of her physically removing women from the mansion house when she discovered their relationship with her husband. The most famous of these accounts involves Eliza R. Snow, who would later become one of the most powerful women in Utah Mormonism. Eliza was living in the mansion house. According to multiple sources, Emma became aware of Eliza's relationship with Joseph, and her response was direct, immediate, and physical. Eliza left the house. This was the marriage. This was the relationship Emma was being asked to memorialize. Two visions of the future were colliding inside a single household. For Brigham Young and the 12, plural marriage was not a scandal to be hidden. It was the architecture of a coming theocracy, a doctrine that would bind the leadership together by blood, multiply the faithful within a generation, and build a kingdom in the desert no outside government could easily dismantle. To Young, this was the future, the path Joseph had set them on, even if Emma refused to see it. For Emma, it was the destruction of her family. It was her husband's signature being placed on documents she would never see. It was women living under her roof whose role she had not chosen. It was her marriage being absorbed into a system she had never agreed to. She was not refusing the Exodus because she was tired. She was refusing it because she had counted the cost. To follow the 12 into the desert was to publicly endorse the practice that had quietly broken her home. It was to give up the last piece of her dignity she still controlled. She was choosing to stay in a city that was dying rather than walk into a kingdom built on what she could not accept. For the 12, this was a public relations disaster they could not solve. They could not force her. They could not denounce her without seeming to dishonor Joseph. The standard answer became some version of grief. She was overcome. She was confused. She was being misled by enemies of the church. The truth was simpler. She had decided. Part 4. The Riverboat Man. In December 1847, 18 months after the Exodus began, Emma did something the church in Utah would never quite forgive. She married again. His name was Lewis Crum Bittaman, a riverboat man from Virginia who had drifted into Hancock County. 41 years old, non-Mormon, by some accounts a drinker, by all accounts no religious calling of any kind. Joseph had spoken with angels. Bittaman spoke with river gamblers, freight haulers, and farmers behind on their debts. Joseph had founded a city. Bittaman had docked at one. Joseph had written scripture. Bittaman could barely write a clean business letter. Joseph had dreamed of theocratic empires. Bittaman dreamed of land deals on the Illinois side of the Mississippi. In Salt Lake City, the news landed like a public insult. The widow of the prophet, the elect lady, the woman who had stood at Joseph's side through every revelation, had married a man who could not have led a Bible class. Sermons in Utah turned sharp. Letters between members of the 12 circulated speculation about Emma's mental state. But look at what Emma actually got from the marriage. Stability. A male partner who had no claim on her late husband's legacy, no interest in her religious authority, no plan to take her children west. A man who would not pressure her to give up the manuscript, to sign over the deeds, to apologize for anything. For the church abroad, the marriage was a scandal. For Emma, it was a roof. Bittaman was not a perfect man. There were accounts of infidelity, including a child born to another woman during the marriage, a child Emma herself would later help raise in the mansion house. He was useful. He was loyal in the ways that mattered. He defended the house. He raised her children alongside her, taking on the role of stepfather without ever attempting to replace the memory of Joseph. She was not finished with the war. She was just choosing the ground. Because while Emma raised her children in Nauvoo, one of those children was growing into something the church in Utah had not planned for. A direct male heir to the prophet, a son named after his father. A young man who would, in time, become the answer to a question Emma had been preparing for since the night Joseph died. Who is the legitimate successor? Part 5. The Bloodline Church. Joseph Smith III was 11 years old when his father was killed. He grew up in Nauvoo, raised by Emma and by Lewis Bittaman, watching the city shrink from a Mormon capital of 12,000 people to a quiet river town of fewer than 1,000. He was not pressured into religious leadership. By multiple accounts, including his own, he resisted it for years. He worked as a farmer. He studied law. He kept his distance from the scattered groups of former saints who were quietly trying to reorganize. But the demand kept coming. Across the Midwest, through the 1850s, small congregations of disillusioned Latter-day Saints were searching for a new direction. They had rejected Brigham Young. They had rejected plural marriage. They wanted a return to what they believed was Joseph's original teaching, and they wanted a leader with the right name. They wanted the prophet's son. Emma's role in this process is one of the most carefully managed aspects of her later life. She did not openly campaign for her son. She did not publicly endorse the reorganization in its early years. She simply made it possible. She kept him in Nauvoo. She kept the manuscripts available. She kept the family's relationship with Joseph's legacy intact and protected. She made the question of bloodline succession a real available option, where it could have been closed off forever if she had taken the children to Utah, or if she had handed the manuscripts to Brigham Young and walked away. She kept the door open. In April 1860, in Amboy, Illinois, Joseph Smith III accepted the presidency of what would become the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His mother sat in the audience. For 16 years, Emma had kept her late husband's manuscripts. For 16 years, she had refused to give them to Brigham Young. Now her son stood at a pulpit and accepted the leadership of a church that openly rejected the Utah hierarchy. He would inherit the manuscripts. He would use them. This was not an accident. This was the architecture of a long, patient strategy that had begun the moment Joseph died. The reorganized church positioned itself as the rightful continuation. It pointed to the bloodline. It pointed to the manuscripts. It pointed to Emma. It said, in effect, the prophet's wife is with us. The prophet's son leads us. The prophet's papers belong to us. What does Utah have that is older than that? Salt Lake City had numbers. It had territory. It had the institutional momentum of the largest religious migration in American history. But for the rest of the 19th century, it could not silence the simple fact that Joseph Smith's widow and Joseph Smith's son were running a different church in the city where it all began, with the manuscripts in their possession. The Bloodline Church on one side, the priesthood church on the other. The seeds of that fight were planted in a wooden box in a house Emma refused to leave. Part 6. The Last Testimony. In February 1879, 2 months before her death, Emma Smith sat down with her son Joseph Smith III and her son Alexander Hale Smith and answered questions she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. The conversation became known as the Last Testimony. It is one of the most disputed documents in 19th century American religious history. Her sons asked her about plural marriage, about whether their father had ever practiced it, about whether he had taught it, about whether the doctrine that had become the foundation of the Utah church had actually originated with Joseph. Emma denied it. She said Joseph had no other wife. She said the doctrine had not come from him. She said the practice attributed to him in Utah was a distortion, possibly an invention, of those who had taken control of the movement after his death. Historians have argued over that denial for more than a century. The documentary evidence against her position is substantial. There are sealing records. There are sworn affidavits from women claiming to have been Joseph's plural wives. There are letters and journal entries from people who said they witnessed the ceremonies. There are the accounts of Emma's own confrontations with women in the mansion house, which themselves seem to presuppose the practice she would later deny. The contradictions are not subtle. So what was Emma doing in that parlor in February 1879? Was she lying? Was she remembering selectively? Was she telling, finally, the version of Joseph that she had chosen to keep? Sit with that question for a moment, because the historical record will not answer it for you. The documents can show you what she said. They can show you what other witnesses said. They cannot show you what she believed in the silent rooms of her own mind. There is no signed confession. There is no private letter where she admits the truth she denied in public. There is only the testimony, given 2 months before her death, by a woman who had spent 35 years choosing exactly which version of her marriage to leave behind. But there is one reading of the last testimony that the documents do support. Emma was not protecting historical truth. She was protecting the father of her children. That is the reading that explains everything. The refusal to go west, the marriage to Bidamon, the keeping of the manuscripts, the silent strategy that placed her son at the head of a rival church, and in the end, the testimony itself. She was not building a history. She was building an inheritance, a version of Joseph that her sons could carry into adulthood without shame, a father they could name themselves after, a prophet they could lead a church beneath. Emma died on April 30th, 1879, in the house she had refused to surrender, in the city she had refused to leave, with the manuscripts still in her possession, with her son leading the rival church. By the standards she had set for herself in 1844, she had won. There is a temptation, when telling Emma Smith's story, to make her a hero or a villain, to frame her as the loyal widow guarding the true faith, or as the bitter ex-wife who could not accept her husband's death. The records do not support either version cleanly. What the records support is this. Emma Hale Smith was 39 years old when her husband was murdered. She was a mother of 5 surviving children, pregnant with a 6th. She lived in a city that was about to collapse, and she faced the most organized religious movement on the American frontier, and she did not give it what it wanted. Not the properties, not the manuscripts, not the public submission, not the children, not the legacy. She made her own decisions about where to live, who to marry, what to say in public about her late husband, and which version of the Mormon story her children would inherit. By any reasonable measure of 19th century American widowhood, this was extraordinary. A widow stayed, a church left, and for the next 35 years, a silent war was fought over which one of them carried the legacy. The answer, depending on where you stand, is still being argued today. In 2 denominations, in 2 sets of scriptures, in 2 competing memories of a man who has been dead for nearly 2 centuries. Emma did not write the answer down for us. She left us the silence and the documents and the manuscripts and the house. She left us the choice. What else was in that wooden box? That is the question that has driven Mormon historians for over a century. The Joseph Smith translation was only part of what Emma kept. There were letters. There were unpublished revelations. There were documents from the inner circle of the Nauvoo years that have never appeared in full in any official archive. She closed the box. She locked the house. She took the silence with her. In the next investigation, we open the records of what survived. Subscribe so the next chapter does not pass you by. Leave a comment with the part of Emma's story you want examined next, and we will pull the documents and build it. The widow stayed. The church left. The box is still being opened, one piece at a time.